the Book of Esther. So continuing in chapter 6 of Esther, Esther 6 and verse 1, it begins, "That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records to of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king." So now we're going to see a reason, if you recall, for the second banquet. They had the one banquet, and Esther didn't really say what she was going to do. So they're going to have a second banquet, and we're kind of left wondering, well, why is it that she did this, and why was there a second banquet? Well, we're going to see a reason for it as we progress through this book. And we'll also see that Mordecai was not initially rewarded some 5 years ago. And we find out now, more than likely, why the reason was. And it's a good thing that Mordecai sat by patiently. And as we go through this, we also see that God's hand was in all of this. In the second banquet, the reason for it, and the things that transpired in between. So continuing in verse 2, "And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus." So like I said, that was 5 years ago. And typically the kings, as you can imagine, when you save their life, were good about rewarding the person who had, again, given them the information. But we have to ask ourselves now, why something like this was overlooked in the first place. He saved the king's life, as we see back in chapter 2 and verse 23. And it should have merited some type of reward right away. But it wasn't. Because, and again, we have to see God's hand in it, that it was delayed for a time such as this. So the obvious answer then is that God is in the picture, and we begin to see this confluence of events in a way that everything works out for the best. It wouldn't have suited God or even Mordecai. It was also another lesson, I'm sure, from Mordecai to glean something from in the interim. He was within the king's gates, and he was in a position that God wanted, and we have to rely on God to be a part of our lives as well as lead and guide and put us in where he wants us to be. And so it seems as though Mordecai was doing that, and God had a plan that he was putting into motion. Verse 3, "Then the king said, 'What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?' And the king's servants who attended him said, 'Nothing has been done for him.'" So, it wasn't an accident that there was a second banquet, and that the king could not sleep, and that he said, "Bring me the Chronicles," and that they read this part, and that all of a sudden now he realizes that he did not do what he should have done. And again, he should have been grateful, and I'm sure he was very grateful that his life was spared, and he did not take that lightly, as we will see here. So the king said, "Who is in the court?" So again, it seems to be early morning, and so here we are going through this night where he couldn't sleep, and he's reading these things, and here's what's left on his mind, and he immediately says, "Who is in the court?" And we see yet again that God has his hand in this. Now Haman had just entered to the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai. So we're seeing the timing, the perfect timing of how God works, on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So not only do we see that God's plan is moving forward, but we also see that this best laid plans of mice and men, as we can call it, will not. In all of Haman's plotting and planning and the power that he had and his plans to go forward and to derail the plan of God, or in his own mind to give Mordecai his comeuppance, it does not come to pass. So we see then in verse 5, the king's servant said to him, "Haman is there standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king asked, and again, now understand, Haman's just walking in, and the king says to him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights in to honor. And Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And even had a certain good reason to believe that, because he was number two in the kingdom. And so he comes in, and naturally his thoughts turn to him, and he thinks, oh, the king's got to be talking about me. So in this time, right before the fall of Haman, we see that he is prideful and he's blinded to what is actually going on. He would have never, I don't think, possibly for a second, said what he is going to say. If he thought it would have been for the princes, I don't think he would have done this, because I think it would have been a challenge to his position. So he for sure thought it was just for him. So the timing of him walking into the court at that point in time is not only impeccable, but it had to be providential. You have to see God's hand in that. So continuing in verse 7, and Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let me tell you what you should do for him. Let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then, that's not all, parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So here we are at the pivot point of the whole story, where this book of Esther turns on a dime. Up until this point, everything seemingly has been going in Haman's way, going his way, and against the Jews. So not going the way of the Jews. But what we're going to see here is that the momentum began to shift, and the plan of God began to manifest itself. We see the fruit of this unseen hand starting to come to bear. Continuing on now in verse 10, then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So one of the things that we can take note of here is that the king knew the lineage of Mordecai. He called him Mordecai the Jew. So it kind of makes us doubt that the king was fully aware of Haman's plans to kill the Jews. All he knew was that Haman said there are these people that do not keep your law. And so we begin to see that Haman may have been a little bit surreptitious in his approach about who exactly it was that he was going to kill. Now continuing on in verse 11, Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Ouch. I can't even imagine, him having to go up to Mordecai after all that he's thought and all that he has said and all that he has done, and then to go out and proclaim. I can just imagine, Haman going out and going, this is a man who he delights, No, I mean, he had to say it. He had to put on a good face and say it. I'm not sure that he put 100% into it, but nonetheless, we see now this incredible swing that's happening in the flow of the story, and things are not turning out the way that Haman had planned. So afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. Didn't want anybody to see him. So then when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. So she already knew that Mordecai was a Jew. So she is saying something else here in terms of, okay, if he's a Jew, because, back, I think in chapter 5, verse 13, it said Mordecai the Jew, and of course Haman's talking about it, and she's, I think, privy to the whole plan. So it's not the fact that it's just because it's Mordecai is a Jew, but it's something else when she says he's of Jewish descent. Surely you will fall before him. I think what she's beginning to see is that this is not just an unfortunate incident, a one-off. If it was, I mean, again, I think it could even be human reasoning that whenever we see something happen, we're going, okay, not everything else has to follow. It's not all bad. Maybe we can recover from this. But what we're seeing here, and what I'm getting the sense of, is that Zeresh here is beginning to see the unseen hand of God in this, and starting to see that this is not just normal. This is not the way things happen unless there is a supernatural force behind it. So at least, she's beginning to see that there's more to this than meets the eye. So continuing in verse 14, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring him Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So now we're beginning to see some of the reasons for the second banquet, not for why Esther planned a second banquet, but why God wanted a second banquet. And there may be even more reasons that we'll get into at a later time. So there's still quite a few things to be worked out before Esther could drop this bombshell. Hence the need for this second banquet. And what seems abrupt in terms of the story flow and the way that we see things happening was always a part of the plan, so that things could continue to unfold just a little bit further before Esther made her proclamation. So now, continuing in chapter 7, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. So please tell me what it is. I'm willing to grant you almost anything within my purview or within my ability." And now she no longer delays or minces words, because the timing is now right for what she has been building up to. So in verse 3, the Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request." All right, so you can save my life by this, and not only mine, but those of my people. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Now, had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So we see one here that they have been sold, right? And this was the money that Haman had paid. And we talked about that earlier, that it seemed like the king may have paid, but in reality, Haman did put this money up. Now she's saying, look, if this situation had come up and we were sold as slaves, then I wouldn't be petitioning here. I could understand. And we can only surmise where the core of this is coming from. As a Jew, she could probably, and more than likely knew that in Deuteronomy 28, that's what we call the blessing and cursings chapter. Verse 15 says, okay, everything from verse 15 down, this is a cursing that follows because of disobedience. So if she was to go into slavery, then she could see that may have been for disobedience, and it's not something that maybe she should risk her life for and all these things, because it would have been a just punishment. And you can put verse 68 of Deuteronomy 28 into your notes, because again, there's a prophecy there that talks about God taking people back into Egypt, back into slavery, and being sold as male and female slaves. And again, it was because of their disobedience. But nonetheless, she says, okay, if that would have been the reason, but that's not the reason. But she goes on to say, okay, not only are our lives in jeopardy, but she says that the king here could not be compensated for his loss. And I think we can only surmise that if the king were to lose his people, lose the Jews within his kingdom, and again, that it's all the people and the work they do. They were people of industry, and they were people that, again, were probably economically doing pretty well. And so that could mean taxes that they would not be giving to the king, and possibly even their possessions. So who knows what kind of plan Haman had in terms of killing them and plundering their possessions, and to what degree that would benefit Haman but not the king. So Esther throws this in there as well, because he paid that 10,000 talents, Haman did, but who knows, with all the possessions of the Jews that he was going to plunder, how much further ahead he may have come out. So all in all, Esther proposes it as, not only is it us, but it's you that's going to be hurt also. Now, continuing in verse 5 of Esther 7, so King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" So I think what we can come to the conclusion on here is that the king was not able to put two and two together. He did not know really what was going on here whenever Esther was saying, look, it's me and it's my people. And the king, again, probably still didn't know who her people were. But he's just going, what's going on? And he couldn't make this connection between what the queen was saying and what Haman was doing. So it does really seem that he was in the dark on this pretty much the whole time. Verse 6, and Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman, okay, in an understatement, was terrified before the king and queen. His plans were now falling down around his feet. These best laid plans that he had for subduing his enemy and for getting and gaining wealth and ridding himself of his problems, beginning with Mordecai through to all the whole Jewish kingdom. So here what we see too, if it's not clear or wasn't clear before, is that Haman is a type of Satan. So when we talk about him being the adversary, like, the roaring lion of 1 Peter 5:8, or the enemy, again, the enemy who sowed the tares was the devil, Matthew 13:39, or the wicked, Ephesians 6:12 says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but spiritual powers and host of wickedness. So what we see here is a direct parallel, if you would, to Satan. Haman in this picture no doubt was a tool of Satan, but nonetheless he was a type as well of Satan, and the role that he was playing in trying to rid the world of God's people at that time. So continuing in Esther 7 and verse 7. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before the queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. So the king here has a lot to take in. One is that Esther is a Jew. Don't think that he knew it up until this point in time. And of course, that meant that her lot was thrown in with the rest of the Jews. And so now he has to deal with the fact that the Jews are also going to be killed. And that, of course, means Mordecai, who he had just honored for this great service that he had done towards the king and saving the king's life. And so now the king is finding out that he more or less signed and sealed their fate in the law that Haman had sent out to all the 127 provinces. And so he also now finds out that his number two, this man of wealth, this most trusted, quote unquote, person in the kingdom who was in his palace and in his court all the time, actually was the one behind all of this. So he was more than likely blindsided by that fact as well. Now, continuing in verse 8, Esther 7:8, when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So in begging for his life, he apparently fell into what could be somewhat construed as a compromising position, though it seems unlikely. There are other people there in the room with him, as we'll see, I think, in the next verse. And also, I mean, it's somewhat ludicrous to think that this is exactly what he was trying to do while he was leaving. So what we do see, though, is that the king's state of mind is that he is not willing to issue him any quarter, and he's going to make the worst of anything that he sees with Haman. And then what we see is that he is removed from the face of the king. So Haman's face is covered up. And if you look at some of the King James version of, say, Esther 1 and verse 14, it talks about the princes being before the face of King Ahasuerus. And so here we have now, he no longer has that honor. His face is covered up, and he's removed from the area. Verse 9, now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." And then the king immediately said, "Hang him on it." So now I think what we need to do is clear up a little misunderstanding. Now, this word, okay, first off, the king says, "hang him on it," which is where I think they get this word gallows from. They infer this word gallows because he's going to be hanged on it. Now, the word for gallows, though, is, I think, a very, very poor translation. It comes from the word for tree or trees, which is most often the way it's translated, or wood. So the word is trees or tree or wood is the way that it's most often translated. It's also translated as stick or timber. So I think when we know that the word's like that, that perhaps we can envision some other construction here that's going on other than the gallows. And it's the first thing I think of. I don't know about you, but when we talk about gallows, I think about the old Westerns and these elaborate setups that they had with the platform, and it's up high in the air, and they had a beam and going up and maybe a couple other support beams on that beam, and then one going across, and then at least one, if not two, three different ropes coming off of it to hang people. And I think that perhaps this is where these English translators were going as well with the word. But I think that the better translation for something like this may be stake, or what else? Maybe a pole or something, and not this gallows as we talk for hanging by the neck with a rope until dead. If you notice in Genesis 40 and verse 19, again, I can just read it for you since it's a simple verse, one simple verse. Just notice what it says here. It says, "Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head," so cut off his head from you, "and hang you on a tree." So the word here for tree is the same exact word as gallows in Esther. So what we have then also to note is that this person did not have a head either. So when they were going to hang him, it says hang you on a tree, again, it was not in the way that we think of a hanging, right? It's more to do with either they impale you onto this stake / tree, or they tie you up, and often you could already be dead before they do it. And so it could be just that it was something for everybody to see. It was, hey, look, take notice what happens to these type of people. Now, when we understand this, it would explain how Haman so quickly erected a gallows, okay, it was just a tree or a pole, for Mordecai, his nemesis, and how he did it so quickly. And also how it could be so tall, because if you start thinking of a gallows being 50 cubits, which is approximately 75 feet, then you go, okay, man, that was a lot to do, and they did it very quickly. Now, it'd still be somewhat of a feat to make one that's 75 feet, just a pole up in the air, and make it sturdy enough to hang a human on, all right, or tie one or impale them on. It still, takes a little bit of work, but not nearly the amount of work. Now, the other thing of interest too, and we're going to perhaps give a clue here, because of what happened here at this specific point, that Harbana just happens to know it's Haman's, but he says from the citadel, he says, "Oh, look over there. There's Haman's gallows that he has, or tree, stake for Mordecai." So he could see it from where he was. And so it kind of leads me to believe that Haman built it so tall so that while he was over there at the citadel with the king, that while he was basking with the king and had the wine and the banquets, that he could look out over there, and he, along with the king, would be able to see his handiwork. And he was, again, I think, very prideful, and prideful enough to do something exactly like that. So continuing on in verse 10 of chapter 7, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. So now we have, I guess if you want to look at it, if you're going to live by the sword, you die by the sword. So Haman had built this gallows. And I'll continue to use the Old English as well as New King James Version of the word here. They hanged him on this gallows, and it was his just desert for the method that he intended Mordecai to die by. He himself was now being hung upon it. Now, continuing on in Esther 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So it was on that day. So there's no time that transpires between the end of chapter 7 and the beginning of chapter 8. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman. He had previously given it to Haman. Haman had it all the way up till this point, and so he was able to do with it as he wished. And so it was a considerable amount of power. But he now gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So on the same day that justice was served to Haman, it was also given to, in that respect, again, it was just that Mordecai be honored for all that he had done. And again, it was at the king's prerogative to do these things. But he took Haman's house and his wealth and his position and took it from him in an instant. And again, who was it that did that? It was God that was working to do these things and influencing matters so that it would happen and could happen. So at this point, Mordecai is raised up to be number 2 in the Persian Empire. So you have Queen Esther, who is a Jewess, is the queen of Persia. And now we have Mordecai, another Jew, okay, in a foreign land, under foreign occupation. They're being raised to the highest points possible, save that of the king. So the question we have to ask, what are the odds of something like that happening? Of course, I'm being facetious that the odds are so astronomical, again, if we want to look at it from a physical point of view, as it could have never happened without God's unseen hand working behind the scenes. So it's just the beginning of this deliverance, though, that God has in store for not only these 2 Jews, but for the rest of the Jews in the kingdom. So we still have the rest of the matter at hand. Now, remember, whatever the king had written, okay, and of course this was Haman writing it in the king's name, whatever that was unalterable. Okay, so let it be written, so let it be said, so let it be done. Right? So Esther 1:19, the law of the Persians and Medes could not be altered. Remember that as we now proceed further. This is what Esther and the king, as well as Mordecai, now have to do with. So Esther 8, chapter 8 and verse 3. Now Esther spoke again to the king. and fell down at his feet, implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he devised against the Jews. So they have to figure out a plan. There has to be a way, okay, because they could not go and just say, okay, let's tear up the decree. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. So she still has to follow these rules of protocol. And she's, again, not thinking of herself too highly and, not being prideful. And so she, again, approaches him in this same demeanor that she has been in the past. And the king holds out this golden scepter. And so she stood and rose before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in the king's provinces. So again, I think we need to understand this in terms of, okay, what does he mean in terms of, or what does she mean, and what does he mean later in terms of revoke, reverse these positions. Okay, he cannot change the law, but he can, and this is what they're working towards, give them the means by which, okay, this is not a fait accompli. So what can the Jews do now so that they are not annihilated and destroyed by the decree that Haman had issued in the name of the king? Now, one of the interesting things here is that this word revoke, which is reverse in the King James Version, is the Hebrew word shub, which means repent. It's one of the words that's used to connotate the word repent in the Old Testament. So I think through this, we get a good idea of what needs to happen. What Haman had done needs to be repented of, and it needs to turn. So physically, technically, it's saying, okay, we need to not go this direction anymore. We need to go this direction. And you completely turn around 180 degrees. So we see that in the terms of what Haman, or what his decree had, what had to be done with his decree. But also, we kind of get a good idea of what it means to repent as well. So the other thing of note, I think, in this verse is that even though the king bears a certain amount of responsibility in this, because he gave the signet and the authority to Haman to do these things and didn't oversee Haman properly and just trusted him, even though he bears a certain amount of responsibility, Esther places most of the blame on Haman, which again seems to be the smart thing to do. So continuing verse 6, Esther 8:6. Esther speaking, saying, for how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. So he acknowledges that this is the case, and he has begun to remedy the situation, which not only, I think, he's not, I think, saying, okay, I've done enough, but I think he's also kind of sending a message to everyone saying, look at where this is going. Look at what side, as it were, that I'm on. The king's always on his own side, but he's showing where he is showing favor in this situation. And so it's this kind of little telltale to everybody saying, this is which way I'm going. And if you're smart, you probably want to be on the same path as well. Verse 8, you yourselves, the king telling it to Esther and Mordecai, write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, which Mordecai now has. He's had that here since verse 2. But it's also the same kind of thing that he had given to, the same latitude that he'd given to Haman. But now I think he believes that he can fully and wholly trust these people. And so he goes on and says, for whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So in a sense, what he's saying here too is that Haman's plan cannot be revoked. But whatever you do has that same power. So you can go ahead and continue to move forward with my authority, my blessing, with this signet, and to make a law, and you see what you see fit to put into motion so that the Jews are not annihilated and destroyed. Verse 9. So now we come to, for trivia's sake, the longest verse in the Bible. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the third month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. So here we are just a little more than 2 months later, all right? And still yet 9 more months to go before the initial decree was to go into effect. It was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, and to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote, verse 10, in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. So again, it's in a similar manner to what Haman had done. And so now we see Mordecai doing it. But now, here is what it allowed the Jews to do. Verse 11, by these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. So by decree of this law, they were given the ability, which apparently they somehow did not have in the past, to defend themselves, to protect their lives. So they were able to now defend from these peoples, that their enemies, who would come and take their lives. Now, it seems to be a little bit of misunderstanding, I think, that creeps in for some people when they initially read this verse, and even some of the commentaries too, that when it talks about the little children and women and plundering of their possessions, they think that this law or right has been given to the Jews to execute against their enemies. And some people look at this and going, well, why would Esther and Mordecai say, okay, yeah, kill the little women and children as well? I mean, we can understand why you would plunder their possessions, but why would you say that? And I think it's just a simple misreading of this, or I don't know where your mind goes, but again, it's just a carry-on from, and it's citing Esther 3 and verse 13, basically. We're saying basically the same thing. So when it talks about, it says that they would assault them, the Jews, it's talking about the men, and then it goes on as well as the little children and women, and plunder their possessions. So it's talking about the Jews here. So again, they get to protect themselves from those who would assault them and their little children and their possessions, is the obvious connotation and simple explanation. And we will also see that this is borne out later on in the chapters here, that the Jews did not kill any women or children, only men, and also that they did not plunder their possessions, even though Haman was going to do this and take it all, and presumably, this is how he was going to benefit from it. The queen and Mordecai saw fit to leave the possessions of their enemies and not take it and hoard it to themselves, but leave it to whatever, benefit the economy, benefit the king, or what have you. Now, I was just going to mention also in Esther 3 and verse 13 that, again, it said, annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, to plunder their possessions. So again, it's simply a repetition of that. And then going on in verse 12 of Esther 8, it says, on one day all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month. So it's repeated what was said in chapter 3 and verse 13, which is the month of Adar. So now continuing, A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province, published for all the people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers rode on royal horses, went out, hastened, and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. So exactly similar to the way it was done initially. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. The burden had been lifted. The hand of this unseen God was now removing their load. Verse 17, in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. So now we have the people in the kingdom see what's moving and how God's hand is in all of this. And they said, well, we want to become Jews too. And the Old Testament had provided ways for people to actually become Jews. And again, this is the overall plan of God, that we're to all become Jews or spiritual Israelites. But even in that day, there was a physical way of doing it, as Exodus 12 talks about. And then this is also reminiscent, I think, of Zechariah 8, verses 22 and 23 as well, where it talks about, and again, this refers to the end time, where everybody once again goes to the Jews after they've been saved and restored, and they're tugging on their sleeves saying, okay, we want to come and seek your God, and let us go with you, for we heard that God is with you. And so to me is kind of a foreshadow of it. And it's the way that humanity works and human nature is, that when you see these things, you say, okay, it's kind of like the atheist in the foxhole. You're going, okay, that's the way to be. That's where I'm going. Now that I see with fear what is going on around me, I'm going to go to the place where it seems better. And so what we see here then is this swing of the pendulum, this change of the tide. And we see Haman demoted and Mordecai promoted by the king. We see that the Jews' numbers increase and that they get to have a bigger army, if you will, because now it's not just the Jews, but it's all the other people joining the Jews, and they know that this fight is still coming, and it was a long way out, and they've had this time to, I think, be circumspect and to say, okay, yeah, this is what I think the side that I should be on, and perhaps they're taking a cue from the king himself. So the people were, in that respect, becoming fearful of the Jews, as it says there at the end of verse 17. So I believe that they see that there's this handwriting on the wall, and that hand is the hand of God. And they see him working to save his people, even though there's no mention of his name in the book. Esther 9 and verse 1. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed on the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. The opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. So now we have almost 9 months that have passed on, and we have to then say, okay, and you may have been saying this along the way too, is that why was it so far out? Why was it that God said, okay, I want this to be another 9 months, or again, 11 months from when it was decreed to happen? And we have to say, okay, now in retrospect, I think there was a lot of things that had to happen, a lot of preparations that had to be done, a lot of shifting of alliances that was then going to happen. So this throwing of the lots, which was, again, what Haman was doing, we see that God had his hand as into when this was going to happen. And perhaps in particular, it was done so that the Jews could figure out who was for them and who was against them. Verse 2, the Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm and no one could withstand them, because fear fell on them and fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. So if you were someone and you were considering going against the Jews, say initially when Haman had sent out the decree, then I think you would have to think twice, knowing where the king stood, and not only that, but where Mordecai was now, the position that he was in, and the power he had, and how that may be used on those who go against the Jews. And indeed, it was. And so those who made this move to get on the right side, to be a Jew with the Jews, made a good decision. Now, verse 4, Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. So again, this is one of the things that happened in those intervening 9 months. He became more renowned, more famous, more powerful, more well-known, and people knew, as it was said, that he was Mordecai the Jew. And it doesn't take too much to put that together. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with the slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. So now what we have is that not only did they have, not only did God keep them safe, but he got rid of their enemies. How could this have happened in any other way? I'm sure it could have happened in some other way, but through this succession of specific events, God's hand can be clearly seen, bringing about events in a manner that not only would the Jews be saved, but they would continue to go on in peace and in safety. There was no way to do this before, where the Jews would say, okay, we want to be peace and safe. Let us rise up within the kingdom of Persia and kill our enemies. That was never going to happen. But here it is. They didn't have to do anything to get into that position. God did it all for them. And now God was not only going to deliver them, but deliver their enemies into their hands, so that their future would also be bright, and it would also be one of peace and harmony. So the sequence of events happened because of what Haman tried to do. And what we absolutely have to realize and know now and see, because not if we can't see this whenever Zeresh could see it, when the people of the land can see it, then I'm not sure what to say. But what we have to be able to see here is that even though God is not in the book written by name, it's obvious that he did all of this. So continuing on in verse 6, and in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And then we see the names of the rest of the sons of Haman right here. And I'm not going to go pronounce them all in verses 7 through 9. And verse 10, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So verse 6, it shows that there was 500 men. Then you have 10 more men here, and we also see that they did not take the plunder. So that, again, verifies what we were talking about before. So why did they kill these sons of Hammedatha, of Haman? I'd have to say because, again, they were against them. They were his sons. They would no doubt take revenge, or more than likely would take revenge in the future. And perhaps this was just the final nail in the coffin of what began so many years ago with the Amalekites, that, okay, here we have now this final complete destruction of the mortal enemy of Israel. Verse 11 of Esther 9, on that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan the citadel was brought to the king, and the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel, the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. So the king is more than willing to help and expedite whatever it is that Esther wanted to help, or whatever she wanted to do with the Jews. So then Esther says, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan, okay, so right there at the city center, to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's sons, 10 sons, be hanged on the gallows. All right, so one of the things that we can, again, say to further one of the points that we were making before is that his sons are already dead, and now she wants to go hang them on the gallows. Again, it was for display purposes. It was also to send a message to say, this is what happens to the enemies of God and to the enemies of the Jews. Let all be aware. And verse 14, so the king commanded and said this to be done, and the decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons, and the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together on the 14th day. So it was the 13th day that they did all of this. Now the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men, again men, at Shushan, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So they're on this next day are finishing off these enemies of God and the enemies of the Jews. Verse 16, the remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives and had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So these were the people in the outlying unwalled areas, as we'll see in verse 19. They had finished all that they had to do, killed 75,000 men, and again, it was men, and they had them rest on the 14th. So they were on the 13th, they fought. On the 14th, they rested. They did not have to fight. They kind of took a position of defense and protection just in case, but they didn't have to do any more. Whereas in Shushan, they went ahead on for another day. Verse 18, but the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well as on the 14th day, to fight, is implied. And on the 15th of the month, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So the ones who were there at the city center, at the citadel in Shushan, they fought one more day. Now, verse 19, therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day, while they were still fighting in the citadel, of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, for sending presents to one another. So the 14th was the first day after they quit fighting. And then Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. So again, we see Mordecai wrote all these things down. And again, this is some take it to be an allusion to he's the actual author of the story of Esther. And we can take that for what it's worth. But nonetheless, he was obviously a prominent source of information. Verses 21 through 23. To establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. So the 2 days of rest, the first day of rest by the ones in the unwalled cities, and then now the other day of rest by the ones in the city center, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another, and of gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them. So this is where the feast of Purim comes from. It was established for the reasons that we've all been reading, and it was obviously a day of great celebration. But what we do have to keep in mind is that this is a man-made holiday and is not to be put up on par with the feasts of God, those mentioned in Leviticus 23. So now the reason for the feast and its name. Esther 9, verses 24 and on. Because Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, or Purim, which is lots, plural, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter which they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews, not God, established and imposed it upon themselves. They did it. And their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation and every family, every province, every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. So again, I find it interesting. I mean, this is a festival that perhaps is on par with Thanksgiving in that respect. That, again, it's one of these ones that we're all happy to do, and it has, it shows God in the picture. But what we also see too is in terms of the validity of the book is that the Jews to this day do this. I mean, this is this celebration that they have is with a lot of joy, a lot of noise making, a lot of partying, and typically they read Esther and reenact it. And when Haman comes on the stage, everybody loves to hiss, and when Mordecai comes, they love to cheer. So it's a very festive and joyful occasion, especially when they see their salvation in it. And the interesting thing is that they still keep it to this day, which to me is a certain amount of, it gives it a certain amount of validity to the story of Esther, which many people are so quick to say, one, it shouldn't be in the Bible, and two, there's no God in it, so that further proves it. So I think that we've shown, as we've gone through this, that indeed God is in this book, and that there are yet many lessons to learn from it. Continuing in verse 29, the Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim, and she gave it her stamp of approval as well, in other words. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with the words of peace and truth to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. And again, this fasting, which is now called the fast of Esther, is typically celebrated the day before Purim, the 2 days of Purim. And again, it's celebrated at that time since there are no other dates that are specified specifically in the book. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. Then chapter 10 goes on and says, the king of Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. So we have this summation and this almost this sense of like, okay, and all was well, and they just went on and everything was great. And I think that is the connotation here, that this tribute by these other lands and islands showed that people were willing, because of the might, or at least the implied might that they saw of Persia, was worth paying tax or tribute to when it came to the fact that there's an empire. And typically tribute was given so that they're not invaded a lot of times. So say, here's a goodwill gesture, a goodwill offering, and it a lot of times kept an empire that may have not been able to go and say take over an area, but it gave it a certain amount of balance. But what we see in this verse is that again, there was a tribute that was being paid not only on the land, but as well as islands in the sea. So I think it really goes to show just how well the kingdom of Persia was going, especially after the fact that now Mordecai was number 2 and Esther was queen, and there was God in the land and God was working with them. So it's obvious, though, that God's the one that grants this favor to kings, and he was the one that did it, I think, through Mordecai. And then verses 2 and 3, now all the acts of his power and his might and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Which some people believe that that was the context that most of this stuff was written in. For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. And so the story goes from rags to riches, from poor to rich, from demoted or those not of any type of standing to those to being of great standing, to not only being protected, but having your enemies vanquished. And we have no other conclusion that we can come to other than to see that it was all done by the unseen hand of God.